This video tutorial is about how to develop your chord progressions. So if you haven't created your chords yet, please see the video on how to create a chord progression. Once you have a chord progression, you can then start to develop your chords to make them sound more interesting. One of the ways you can do this is to add seventh notes. The chords that we have been using so far have been triad chords. This means they are made up of the root, third and fifth notes. For example, in a G chord, the notes are G, B and D. To make our chords more interesting, we can add the seventh note on top. To do this, all we do is go to our fifth note, for example D in our G chord, miss out the next note, which would be E, and go to the next note, which is F. This is the seventh note of the chord. However, in our G chord, this would actually be an F sharp, so make sure you remember the sharps and flats of the key you are in. Be aware that you have different types of sevenths based upon the intervals, and this could create some unwanted clashes. So as always, listen to your composition. Does it sound nice? Another way you can make your chords more interesting is to use inverted chords. The root of the chord doesn't always have to be at the bottom. You can move the third or the fifth notes to the bottom, and this can help to create contrast for the listener. For example, our G chord, we originally had our root note G at the bottom, and then B above that, and then D above that, and this is our G major triad. However, if we move the G to the top of the chord, the bottom note then becomes B. The B and D notes stay in the same position, but the G has moved to the top. Be careful where you place the note, as it must still be a G note. This is called a first inversion. If we then move the B to the top of the chord, the bottom note then becomes D. The D and G notes are in the same position from the first inversion, but the B moves to the top. This is called a second inversion. The notes of the chord are exactly the same, but the inversions will make the chord sound more interesting to the listener. You can also do this with seventh chords in the exact same way. You should experiment with the different inversions and see which ones you think sound best for your composition. Another way you can make your chords more interesting is to change the rhythm. Rather than have one or two chords being held for the length of the bar, you can use different length notes and rests to make the rhythm interesting. Look at these examples. The chords are staying the same throughout the bar, but the rhythms are changing. In some cases, there are two chords per bar, and then the chord changes halfway through. If you look closely, some of the chords are moving to inverted versions at the end of the bar to make the chords sound more interesting. You should experiment with different rhythms for your chord progressions. Try to come up with a phrase or a set of rhythms that you can then repeat. Another technique you can use to make your chords more interesting is to use broken chords or arpeggios. Up until this point, all of our chords have been block chords. This means we have been using all of the notes of our chords on top of each other. But when we write a broken chord, we can use the notes of the chord separately rather than all together. We are still using the same notes, so it will still be the same chord, but our chords can become more melodic. These chords here are based on the same chords as above, but written as broken chords, so the notes are played separately. An arpeggio is very similar, but the notes must ascend or descend in the order of the chord. For example, this C chord is an arpeggio because it is going from the bottom note to the top, from C, E to G. Try out some broken or arpeggio chords in your chord progression. Chord progressions, or accompaniment as it's sometimes called, usually goes across the bass and the treble clefs. Think left and right hands of the piano. You can add a bass part to your chord progression by adding a pedal note underneath. A pedal note is a long-held note, and this is usually the first or the fifth note of the scale of the key signature you are in. Alternatively, you could have the bass notes, which are the bottom notes of the chord, being held. Or if you are using broken chords or arpeggios in the right hand, you could have the chord or some of the chord being played underneath in the bass part. You do not need to use all of these techniques to make your chord progression more interesting, but try out some of these and see which ones work for your composition. Good luck!